Welcome to Captains of Industry. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, this week in the chair we have Jyoti Keshavan. She's the CEO of Xanara Investment Management. She does business across the African continent, and she's here in the studio to talk about investment and also her life and beginnings. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, just to give us an idea of your family, where you come from, who you are.
Well, my parents moved to Dubai way before the 1960s. As part of any of the immigrating Indian families, they moved there, started to build up their little career. My mother was with the British Bank of the Middle East, which is now, of course, the HSBC. My dad worked for a couple of companies and finally ended with a textile house. Did my schooling there. I was born there, in fact. I was born.
And you were born there, and you've seen, you've got an incredible story inside you. You saw how Dubai has transformed over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
What was it like when you were a child growing up?
Well, I think during those days, I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s, right? So growing up there, you just had the sand around, and you just had the little low-rise, we call those little, the Bedouin villas. Used to have that, and then you used to have sharing rooms. And I think the first skyscraper that we had there was the World Trade Center, which was sometime during the 1968, 1970s. And that was like iconic, right? So as kids with all the desert around, and then traveling by little jeeps, and then used to have the transportation of water through the camels. It was typically a very, very unique, like living in a desert like a nomad.
Now, this World Trade Center, it was the first kind of high-rise building, and it was also the tallest building for quite some time. Just give us an idea of, what it was like and how much of a curiosity it was then.
As kids, it was like going there was like going to a picnic, right? So if dad and mom say, let's go around and look at the World Trade Center, we would say, wow, hippie, it's like going there. But obviously it's a World Trade Center. It had all the large conglomerate companies there from various parts of the world. It eventually had the US Embassy there. So it was a very secure environment, right? But going there was absolutely astonishing as kids for us there. And we used to also travel by like a little jeeps. So the cars will eventually start coming in. And the World Trade Center was right, during those days, it was not the Sheikh Zayed road that we had, which is now known as the Sheikh Zayed road, the very popular road. So the Trade Center was right there, surrounded just by the deserts, right? And you had this little roundabout, which is now known as the Etisalat roundabout. And over the years, and that was actually the end. The World Trade Center was the end of Dubai. We all thought it was the end. That was just the end of Dubai, because nothing beyond it, just sand dunes. But over the past maybe 20, 25 years, we've just seen the entire Dubai starting from the World Trade Center. So you had the whole Sheikh Zayed Road, you had the DIFC, you had the whole community growing around the World Trade Center.
Was there any idea then, back in the days when the World Trade Center first opened, that it was going to be what it is today, that it was going to develop so quickly and so vastly?
Having born, raised, lived in Dubai, and did my schooling there as well, right? Did my high school there until I went back to India to do my undergrad. But while living there, we've always been taught, I think interacting with the ruling family members during those days was also very, very common, because it was always very normal. There was no bureaucracy to the system, and it is not so even today. Learning from the leaders there, we have realized how resilient they are to the whole country, how they really want to reach a certain pinnacle and want to really make sure the country grows in bounds. So seeing that, we sort of felt that this is a place to be in, not just for a few years, but definitely you could make a life and you could make generations in this place.
And how did you see the signs as you were growing up and you were leaving school, that this is going to be as big as it turned out to be?
Until my high school, which was somewhere around the early 90s, I don't think I had the vision for this whole Dubai being a growth story. But when I came back after my undergrad, I just came for a short period, and I saw the changes happening there, then I knew there is something really getting built up. But this entire, the whole growth, the whole vision actually transformed into what you see Dubai now, I think since 2000, from 1996 2000, that's been a tremendous change. And I think that's when the ruling family members wanted to decide and see that we need to get, if we want to have Dubai growing up, we need to have more population coming in. We need to open up the infrastructure. We need to open it as a free trade. We need to have more robust intellect people coming in here to make this growing. So Dubai is predominantly an expat crowd, as we see today. And it's always been that way, right? So,
in terms of economic management, what do you think were the key decisions that helped to usher in this sort of development of it as a business centre?
See, I think one is the openness, adapting to new population. So I think if you just see, you had, like I said, it's an expat crowd, right? So you've got the Asians, you've got the Southeast Asians, you've got the Arabs from the different part of the world, you've got the Europeans, right? The Dubai is built in such a way that it is the best of all worlds. It's got the East and the West and the North and the South meeting in there. So when a person comes down to build up a career, build up a business, he comes with a mindset of spending maybe 5 years, not more than 5 to 7 years in Dubai. But we have rarely seen people actually not staying back after that, right? So they're always there. They build their families there. They have their children. They build their businesses. So today, as we speak, we've got generations of families staying there. So I think it's about giving people the freedom to make a living, replicating what they would have back home. So if you have somebody from Finland coming to stay in Dubai, replicating the same kind of infrastructure or same kind of social stream there for all these people.
What sort of lessons do you think, I mean, an African continent here, a lot of countries are looking to grow and develop as quickly as that. What sort of lessons do you think Dubai can lend to countries looking to grow here in Africa?
Okay, like I said, Dubai is it's a very resilient place, right? And it's one of the few countries where, at least living there, I've seen that they grow and learn with their mistakes, right? We had situations in 2008 and 1997s where I think there have been some economical mistakes, there have been financial errors. And Dubai has come out, and UAE has come out predominantly and come out and said that, you know what, we made an error, and I think we need to move on with life, right? So when you have this kind of a mindset, when you have this kind of a boldness to build a country, I think that's a lesson that many people can learn, right? And they can just probably, it's about adapting to this whole system. And I think that's a message that's gone out very clearly to Dubai. It's all about, you need to create, and through the process of creating, you are bound to make mistakes and errors, and just learn and move on.
And now fast forward, all these years later, you actually have an office in that very first high-rise, where, I mean, it must be quite weird. How do you feel about that?
It's an irony, actually. It's really an irony. I mean, we didn't plan this. I mean, I definitely did not plan going to the World Trade Center. I think the entire industry was going to a different platform altogether, a different premise. I think when we decided to build up, or we decided to go independent with Xanara, we wanted to also have an office for our marketing purposes. So in Dubai, because we all have families out there, the entire clan of family is based there. We want to have an office, and we want to have an address which could really resonate with the growth of Dubai, right? And we couldn't think of any other place than the World Trade Center. And above all, if you just take an Emirates flight and you just land in Dubai, and you will see all roads leading to a signboard of World Trade Center. So we wanted that as an iconic address for ourselves. Yeah, nostalgic though, I must admit. When you go inside, I had to take an office there, and I looked around the whole place, and I was like, wow, this is the place where I used to be just holding my dad's hands and walking around as a kid. But today I just feel very happy that I'm there.
And last but not least, when it comes to Dubai, you probably never thought all those years ago when you were holding your dad's hand in the World Trade Center that in 2020, Expo 2020 would be coming, the whole of the world would be descending upon Dubai, something like 10 million visitors. Yeah. How much of a shot in the arm do you think that's going to be for the economy?
No, I think it's a big boost, Chris. I mean, seriously, I think there's a lot of energy gone into this whole the whole infrastructure of Expo 2020. We see that happening. I think in the past, ever since it was announced that Dubai is going to host the Expo 2020, and let's not forget, I mean, I think people never knew what's a Expo, right? I mean, when Dubai got the award, the tender to host it, I think I was one of the few people who would have probably Googled up to check when was the last Expo in which part of the world, right? So once you realize the magnanimity of this entire function, then you just suddenly realize, wow, a small place like Dubai, which was a place where I grew, and suddenly it's hosting a world event. So it's absolutely a celebrity affair for us. So where do we see Dubai going? Definitely on the world map, definitely in terms of growing the infrastructure, new business houses coming in, more filtration of people coming in, but more regulations, but yeah.
And investment as well. I mean, how do you think investment might be, I mean, bearing in mind Dubai is often seen as a sort of hub for investment in the African continent. How do you think that could be given a boost by this 2020 Expo?
Like, there's a lot of foreign investments coming into Dubai. Right now, I think the way the Expo 2020 is marketed is, I think the team Expo 2020 has been traveling across the globe, talking to every sponsor or talking to every colleagues of theirs, right, including Africa. They've been telling them, please, we need to have you present yourself there. So I think it's a platform, right? It's a platform for every single continent, including Africa. And Africa being one of the biggest continent for us, it's a great friendship that UAE shares with Africa. So welcoming them to host and to present themselves in a platform like Expo 2020, I think it's a lot of incoming of the foreign direct investments from any part of the world, for that matter, not just Africa. But I think it's a welcoming message for everybody.
Your company is domiciled in Mauritius,
That's right,
which is very much wanting to be an investment hub and regarding the African continent. Just give us a quick sketch of which countries you're involved in Africa, and also, you know, what you actually do here.
Okay, so my business brings me to this part of the continent, yeah. So I think it's important to know the background of how we started this off. So I've been in the investment banking and the wealth management industry for many, many years. And I think sometime in 2010 onwards, right, we have had situations where we have realized when you're working with a certain employer, a certain organization, there are limitations that an employer can do in that industry. And in order to basically be agile with the clients and in terms of adapting to new investment options, and we saw that it was more and more compelling and more we were pushed to get into a stream like this. So in 2012, I decided that I'm going to look at building up a system or a platform called a multifamily office, which was it's a thriving industry today, a multifamily office in the wealth space. It's a thriving industry. It's very prominent in Europe and very prominent maybe in Singapore. And I wanted to build this up. Now, what does a multifamily office do? A multifamily office is one where it is basically a consolidation effect. It's a single-stop advisory firm for institutions, for ultra-high net worths, for families, right? And so we work closely with families whom we represent, right? So I'll give you an example. You would have a family out of, say, out of India, out of Africa, who are a few generations into their business. So they've got the personal wealth and they've got the business wealth. So we come there as an advisor on how they move around passing their wealth, their businesses to generations going forward. And this was a new concept across the globe, and we wanted to put this together, and it requires regulations. And Mauritius was obviously there in the league in terms of being in the investment management business during those days in the multifamily office. So when we went there in 2013, 14, we approached them and we said, we want to build it up. And we were warmly welcomed by the Mauritian families there, and that's how we built it up. And again, going back to my industry where I was working earlier with some of the Swiss banks, I used to cover a lot into Africa. So I used to travel into South Africa, into Tanzania, etc. And so we realized then that a gateway into Africa is through Mauritius more. So that also compelled us into building Xanara through Mauritius.
How do you think Mauritius has shaped up in recent years in this quest to try to build itself up as Africa's another hub for investment in Africa?
Okay, Mauritius is a very competitive jurisdiction. I think it's very underplayed. When we put this together in 2013-14, we just felt that they're very underplayed. But today, when we see them, and we've been working out of Mauritius for the past 5 years now, and when it comes to African continent, I think the first rights go to Mauritius on autopilot, and then I think it's the other jurisdictions. So Mauritius is up the league in the investment management industry, in the fund management industry, in the the private wealth now. It's still shaping up. It's still shaping up in the multifamily office industry, and so we are very happy to be in Mauritius as being one of the first pioneers in that segment.
And which countries in Africa are you operating in, and which do you think are a good bet right now here in as we speak?
So we are very agnostic about which country. I mean, obviously, for us, our clients are across any countries. It could be even Africa, it could be even, say, Southeast Asia, it could be even Vietnam, it could be Cambodia, for that matter. What we go out there in places, or in Africa for the matter. For example, we were the other day, a couple of months back, we were in Ghana, and so we wanted to meet up, say, for example, with the pension funds, right? So we actually go out there to identify is there a way we could work on their asset allocation of their for their pension monies, and how we could improvise the yield. So when we go to them, we go with a complete battalion of tools and with proposals, and we just sort of showcase of our past performances, etc. And so our clients are not just restricted to individuals. It's institutions, it's pension funds, it's mutual funds, it's families, and again, it could be across any of the 54 countries in Africa as well.
And how much is your belief that in the last few years that a lot of the countries in Africa have changed their mindset towards investment, particularly foreign investment?
Oh, I think there's quite a bit. For example, we see South Africa has definitely opened up doors to look at a lot of foreign players to come and work with them. Yeah, we've seen that in Rwanda, for that matter. We've seen that in Mozambique, for that matter. We've traveled to places like Nigeria, and we've seen that is extremely welcoming, right? So I think for us, those are a big change. If I, like I said, in the last 10 years, I mean, I've been traveling into Africa extensively, and I see this trend of change and openness more so maybe in the last 4 years, and I think that's tremendous change for us. Yeah.
And in terms of the pragmatism you're seeing, what kind of changes in approach and regulation are you seeing that's encouraging the idea of investment on this continent?
Okay, so Chris, regulation, it's a very broad subject, right? But regulation varies from country to country. So, for example, if you're talking about a client, for example, talking client in Africa, any part of Africa, for example, let's take South Africa, so I'm sitting here right now, right? You have a certain kind of regulation in this part of the world, right? So obviously the regulation plays an important role about where the investment should happen, right? Now when the investment happens, and if it happens cross-border, say it happens in Southeast Asia, a regulation applies there too for the incoming money coming in. So you're talking about two regulations on a similar objective. Yeah. So regulation is it's very hectic. It's a constant change all the time, And as long as the clients are willing to adapt to this change, I think it's a smooth sail for everybody.
And in your industry, what would help investors, you think, in terms of regulations and reform on this continent, particularly when it comes to the repatriation of funds?
Okay, now when it comes to repatriation, I mean, obviously that is a topic that's a completely different topic altogether. But again, like I said, regulation, compliance plays a very serious role in terms of the money flowing out of the system or money coming back into the system, right? So obviously, we're talking about, again, like I said, if the funds are moving out of a certain country where there is repatriation laws, then obviously it applies. And it also applies to the country it's receiving it, because it also has its onus and responsibility of making sure that the money goes back into the system. So I'm not going to say if it's good or bad, but I think that's the way forward, and it's important for all of us to adapt to it.
And what about compliance? I mean, it's not too many years ago now, probably a couple of decades, where people could pour millions of dollars into countries and no one would even ask where
Not
it came
anymore.
from. Not anymore now.
Not
I mean,
anymore.
it's $10,000 and
Not
you've
anymore.
got to fill in forms.
I don't know the limits. I mean, obviously, there are different limits for different places, countries, institutions, banks, etc. But I don't think that's so smooth anymore.
But that's good for investment, though, surely.
I think it's good. I think it's a good discipline. I think it's a good discipline. It's a good know your client. I think that's important. And I think that's where I see the transformation, right? So you would have clienteles who would have been used to a certain decorum of compliance, and suddenly, in 30 years, the entire landscape of compliance has changed. So obviously the client has to adapt to that, otherwise he's going to be nowhere. I think compliance is good as long as it helps us do the business, and that's a constant change again for us.
Now, you mentioned here some of the discrepancies between nations on the African continent when it comes to regulations and rules and the like. What about this African free trade area that's been talked about? Do you have hopes for that?
Oh, totally. I think so, completely, yeah. I mean, the free trade is something that we look upon to, and I think that's even from a Mauritius perspective, or even from an African perspective, I think that's something that has been very welcoming change for everybody. Yeah.
And there's been some talk that you'd be able to make an investment and get settled in another country very, very simply and very, very easily. Yeah. Do you foresee that happening? I mean, it may take a lot of time.
Oh, definitely. I think that's again, like I said, it's about giving an independence, giving a freedom to an investor to do what he likes to do within the framework of what has been provided. So I think that's very welcoming.
Looking ahead, I mean, talking about risk and rewards on this continent, how do you see that? How optimistic or otherwise are you looking ahead 10, 20 years, bearing in mind the economies here are having a very difficult time at the moment?
Okay. I think what is important is transparency on the risks and rewards. So obviously, historically, there's been a lot of investments coming into Africa from different parts of the world. I think going forward, what we see is, I think people look for transparency of where the money is going into what risky component, or what risky investments, what risky asset classes it's going into, and what rewards. So I think investor is willing to take a risk as long as there's a transparency on the rewards and transparency of repatriation, transparency of liquidity. And that's very key. And that's always been there, but I think it's just getting more streamlined in the past few years. And Africa has actually, I think for that matter, the entire continent is building to develop that transparency, because if they want to be part of the international markets, clearly, we need to really have that in place.
What about infrastructure investment? I mean, the African Development Bank is trying to blend private and public money to try to take some of the risk out of it. Do you see there's a huge gap on this continent, unfortunately, but do you see investors coming in to take up that slack?
You know, investors also always want to see whose neck is on the line, right? So that's end of the day. Is the government going to put the neck on the line? Is the private sector going to put a neck on the line? It's like our business, right? If you're going to advise a client to do something, we put our neck on the line. Otherwise, we don't advise. So similarly, when the money comes in, and for infrastructure, the investor wants to see what happens in the eventuality. So someone has to be held responsible. So I think if that is there, we could see a lot more.
Well, let's hope for good things
No,
for
we're
the
very
future,
positive, yeah.
for the African continent. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That's Jyoti Keshavan, the founder and CEO of Xanara Investment Management, talking about the investment case for the African continent. That's all we've got time for on this edition of Captains of Industry. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.